Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining me now from London is Wayne Fitzgerald. He's a city councillor and chairman of the Peterborough Conservative Association. He wants the UK to leave the European Union. Also with us from Berlin is Gordon Guthrie, a former candidate for the Scottish National Party. He's the author of a book about Scotland after Brexit, and he wants to remain in the EU. From London, we're also joined by Alan Wager. He's a research associate at the UK in a Changing Europe initiative at King's College. And joining me right here in the studio is David Smith, Washington Bureau Chief for The Guardian newspaper. Welcome to all of you. David, let's start here in the studio. We've had two votes. Theresa May has lost both of them. Quite a bit of chaos in the House of Commons. Break it down for us. Where does this leave the United Kingdom right now, and what's next?
It is all quite head-spinning and probably summed up by the fact that Stephen Barclay, the Brexit secretary, made a speech urging people to vote one way and then promptly went and voted against his own speech. So it's all rather bewildering, and as we speak as well, Labour is divided too. Where things stand is that we do seem to be heading for an extension, a postponement of this deadline. Clearly, Parliament expressed a desire for that strongly. It's not quite a done deal because the European Union, all 27 members, have to agree to that. But it would be quite a surprise, I think, if they didn't. The EU has made clear that it was never a fan of Brexit in the first place, but especially a no-deal scenario is something where everybody loses. In the meantime, I think another interesting development here is that in this flurry of votes we've had in the last few days, there was an opportunity for Parliament to sideline Theresa May and say, we're going to work through it and find out what a majority supports. And with some help from some Labour rebels, that was actually rejected. And what it means is that the hardline Brexiteers have perhaps missed a chance. It's back in Theresa May's hands. We'll have yet another vote, as you heard, next week, and sooner or later the hardline Brexiters are going to have to decide, do they really want to stick with this or face a potential very long-term postponement, maybe even until 2021, and who knows where we'll be by then.
Just one point, David, you mentioned the extension. What point would an extension serve?
That's a question I've been wrestling with myself for quite a long time. If we've been now nearly 3 years of total deadlock and just political paralysis in Britain, why is an extra few months going to solve anything? And I wait to hear a satisfactory answer to that. And I think the worry is that Brexit has been so negative for Britain's political discourse and its civil discourse, and other issues, healthcare, dealing with poverty, dealing with education, have really been put on hold. Part of me really worries that a delay is just going to mean that those issues are neglected for even longer. Right,
it is the biggest and only issue in Britain right now. Alan Wager, there has been a response from the European Commission. They issued a response to the vote. It said that the UK would not automatically be granted an extension to Article 50. The EU would have to consider its own interest. Now, Alan Wager, Prime Minister May, her deal has been voted down twice. And as David Smith just pointed out, there might be another vote next week. Is there any likelihood that it will pass?
I mean, it's possible. I think the calculation of Theresa May is that it will be a lot closer next week, despite no element of the deal actually changing. None of the substance will change. The only thing that will have changed is it will become even clearer to those Brexit supporting MPs who are arguing for a harder Brexit than she's willing to give so far, that they really have little option other than, as David said, a much longer extension period of a year, maybe even 21 months, or voting for this deal at the third and potentially final attempt.
Let's bring in Wayne Fitzgerald. Wayne, clearly these multiple votes are going nowhere, so why not just take it back to the people, have another referendum?
What's the question? What is the question in another referendum? The world is looking on. We must seem like a pantomime is taking place in the shadow of Mother of all Parliaments, where I sit tonight. It's a complete disaster for everybody concerned. And I don't know where it goes next. There's even talk about a motion of no confidence in the government, supported by many in the Conservative Party. What does that tell you about the state of the nation? But come to the people's vote. We had a people's vote on the 23rd of June 2016. What would the question be? Is it like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Leave or Remain? Final answer? I don't know what that vote would be.
Gordon Guthrie, nice to have you again on the show. But as Wayne just pointed out, it's been almost 3 years since British voters decided they wanted to leave the European Union. The deadline is March 29th. Can anything be achieved by then?
I think in the Great Crash in 1929, J.K. Galbraith had this lovely line that the end had arrived but was not yet visible. I think the end, a no-deal crash out, arrived sometimes before Christmas, and it's just now becoming visible. This is a comedy of errors. There's 15 days to go. The government doesn't have a plan, and everything's depending upon the Europeans accepting this. So I think the real two options that we do have is either crash out in 2 weeks' time, which will cause the United Kingdom to collapse, or possibly the Europeans will offer some ludicrously long 2-year extension and expect the UK to go through some sort of process to decide what it wants. Because the 3 years have been, I mean, we've talked, people said, oh, this is, Britain doesn't know what it wants. Actually, you know, England voted out, Scotland voted in. The collapse of, you know, the collapse of political authority is happening in Westminster, which is also the English domestic parliament. Scotland has a perfectly good functioning government. Wales has a perfectly good functioning government. This really is a terrible English political crisis, and I can't see how England gets out of it until it decides what sort of country it wants to be.
Gordon, if there is an extension, even if it is as long as 2 years, does Britain remain a member of the EU during that time?
During the extension period, Britain would remain a member of the EU. We'd have to have European elections. Things would continue as they are at the moment, and that potentially for the European Union is a problem, because as a current member of the EU, Britain has a veto on certain things, and having Britain hanging around like a sulky teenager might not be what people want. So, and the deadline for the European elections is looming, and that cannot be avoided. The European Union is an institution of law, and if we're in the European Union because we have an extension, we have to be represented by elections. So it's tremendously problematic for the European Union, and it's a particularly hard call for the Irish to make. You know, what happens if there's a crash out in 2 weeks? Northern Ireland becomes bandit country. I mean, you know, some people think it's Moldova. It is now. I mean, it's shocking. Shocking.
David, the big focus, of course, is on Prime Minister Theresa May. This is what she had to say on Wednesday. Let's watch this.
The legal default in UK and EU law remains that the UK will leave the EU without a deal unless something else is agreed. The onus is now on every one of us in this House to find out what that is.
She's standing her ground, David. You know, we often hear politics is the art of compromise. Why this intransigence?
She doesn't regard it as complete intransigence so much as trying to balance these very delicate needs. And as one of the other speakers mentioned, Scotland and Wales didn't vote this way, but of course, very importantly, Northern Ireland wanted to remain in the EU, and this Irish border question is central here. And yeah. I'm told, you know, Theresa May, when concerns are raised within the US about the Irish border, where of course there's quite a strong Irish lobby, the message is given, look, she's really fighting hard on this issue to prevent the restoration of a hard border and all the security concerns that are raised there. I mean, she's been handed a poison chalice with this entire Brexit issue, and again, I'm told within the White House there's some admiration for her tenacity and the way she's handling it, but perhaps not from Donald Trump himself. He said today at an event with the Irish Prime Minister that Theresa May has not been listening to his advice on how to strike a deal. Trump himself regarding himself as the expert deal maker, but historians can judge whether things would have gone better with the Trump approach. But certainly for now, I concur with fellow speakers who've described this as a pantomime and a comedy of errors.
Alan Wager, perhaps we should get into a bit more detail on the Irish border question. For our viewers all over the world, it's the only land border between the United Kingdom and the EU is between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and that's led to something known as the backstop. That's a new word in our lexicon right now. Give us an overview of why it is such a big stumbling block right now.
So the backstop exists to protect the border between the EU and what will be an external third country after Britain leaves the European Union, the UK. So the backstop is needed because the UK has decided to leave the customs union and the single market, the sort of basic core elements of the European Union. And it's also said that it wants to be able to strike free trade deals around the world and not have a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And these things are basically incompatible. And so the way that they've got around this is by creating this backstop, which would ultimately, a lot of people that are in favour of Brexit say that they ultimately think that would mean that Britain would have to stay in the customs union and the single market. And that's true, unless Britain could come up with some new, different alternatives to having a border between a third country and the European Union. The Northern Ireland certainly would effectively stay in the customs territory of the EU.
Right, and Alan, there are also some security concerns about a resumption of a hard border there.
Absolutely, the big fear is a return to violence on the island of Ireland, and if there's going to be customs posts, for example, in the event of Britain leaving the European Union, they are open to vandalism, and they'll need to be manned by police, and those police will need to be protected by an army, and this is all bringing back the British Army potentially onto the island of Ireland. These things are really sort of bringing back a huge amount of historical resonance, this idea of introducing a new border on this island in Ireland.
Wayne Fitzgerald, the opposition leader... Go ahead, Gordon.
But things have changed in Ireland since the Good Friday Agreement. So the border now runs through the city of Derry. The suburbs are in the Republic, some of the suburbs. And so, you know, you'll literally be carving a border through a city. And today we've had news that a paratrooper is going to be charged for shooting at Bloody Sunday in 1972. The Bloody Sunday, the site of that shooting is 1.5 miles from the border. So this idea that we can do things off the border is frankly nuts. It bears no relation to the physical geography of North. I mean, sitting here in Berlin, realistically talking about a hard border through the city of Derry, it was unthinkable as little as 2 weeks ago, but that's what will happen.
Look, it's a ridiculous notion. That is just a ridiculous notion in terms of that kind of level of, you know, border patrol, soldiers on the streets. We've moved a long way in Northern Ireland, and, you know, let's substitute the word trap for backstop, as many people would suggest, because we have no unilateral escape from that backstop, as the Attorney General said himself repeated times. And the EU's idea of a concession is to change the word "and" to an ampersand. They've conceded nothing. There is no need for a hard border in Ireland, and technology is available that will solve those customs problems. And if everybody wants to work together in peace and harmony, the EU would do the deal that is the right deal, and we can continue trading as friends as we did the day before we left. We should leave on the 29th of March and go straight to WTO terms and sort everything out from that point onwards.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Thomas Murphy, who was the IRA commander in South Armagh on the Army Council, had a farm which crossed the border. That farm alone in the Troubles generated 6 figures of illegal money from smuggling. One single farm. If you have the idea that Northern Ireland can have an honesty box with 0 tariffs, you are living in cloud cuckoo land. This is nuts. The population on both sides of that border are ethnic Irish. There are a smattering of Protestant villages, Falkhill, there's some out in the west, but overwhelmingly the population doesn't want that border. I worked in politics in Belfast during the war in the 90s. South Armagh was a military camp and they couldn't stop smuggling. Once you get that, you end up with a Moldova-style situation. Every single gangbanger who wants to make money by dodging customs duties will set on both sides of that border. It's crazy.
Do you honestly think there is no smuggling now?
And David, one of the
you
concerns...
honestly think there's no smuggling now that goes on across borders within the EU? That is just a stupid suggestion. Of course it happens now,
there isn't smuggling
both in terms of big business and or indeed individuals. Nobody's suggesting a hard border whatsoever, and everybody is committed, and the Prime Minister has committed
what smuggling
to not
can
having a
take
border.
place in the European Union?
If it comes in through any border across the European Union, whether it's people or anything else, it happens. And we need technology, and we also need security services in every European country, whether that's between the UK and Southern Ireland. Those things are just normal business.
David, one other point on this border. One of the concerns we've heard is that Britain doesn't want a soft border because then it would have to be out of the European Union but still abide by European Union regulations.
Yes, maybe be part of the customs union. I mean, and be sort of out of the European Union in name only. I think, and that's the sort of fundamental contradiction around the Brexit idea, and how I think really the Irish question was much neglected before the vote even happened. You know, how can you be part of a customs union and yet not? You know, I think many Brexit purists, many voters, probably thought they were going for a hard Brexit under WTO rules.
Right.
And clearly, many still wish that would be the case, even in Parliament, because in some ways that would be the only way to genuinely resolve that. But as you've heard, many would say with disastrous consequences.
Wayne Fitzgerald, I want to get back to the events in London. Now, the opposition leader in the British Parliament, Jeremy Corbyn, he weighed in after the vote on Thursday, saying a deal can be reached with his plan. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Tonight, Mr. Speaker, I reiterate our conviction that a deal can be agreed based on our alternative plan that can command support across the House. And I also reiterate our support for a public vote, not as a political... Mr. Speaker, not as political point scoring, but as a realistic option to break the deadlock.
So Mr. Corbyn, Wayne, has been pushing for a general election. Is that now on the cards, and how will it resolve this logjam?
Look, Labour will try anything to get in power. You will notice he didn't call it a people's vote. You will notice he's reluctant about nailing his colours to the mast because he knows in the Labour heartlands in the north of the country particularly, this is the biggest betrayal of parliamentary democracy that, you know, in modern terms, that has ever been in Westminster. The Labour Party have lost all credibility. Jeremy Corbyn as a leader has no mandate to lead the country. And more, you know, the lies of his campaign in 2017, promising, you know, free student loans and bus passes for pensioners, a free unicorn if you voted Labour. It's just fantasy stuff. And even in his own camp, there is nobody that will rally round Jeremy Corbyn. They are as clueless as the Conservatives, which is my own party, and divided equally as much. But we need to find a way through this. And as the law stands today, we will leave on the 29th of March, as the Prime Minister has promised over and over. And I hope she sticks to that promise, because the country will feel betrayed if not.
Gordon, if we look at what's going on in Brussels right now, on the other side of the English Channel, there's a huge amount of frustration there. This was what Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, tweeted on Thursday. He said, "During my consultations ahead of the European Council, I will appeal to the EU 27 to be open to a long extension if the UK finds it necessary to rethink its Brexit strategy and build consensus around it," unquote. The European Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, has already said that there's no room for negotiation. Can Theresa May get a better deal with the Europeans?
Well, there is no better deal. The Europeans laid out a series of offers in the famous ladder that went from Canada to Norway 3 years ago, and the UK's consistently refused to pick one of those options. We want to have the benefits of being the European Union, which is free trade and seamless services, without paying either the bill or following the rules of the club. And so what the problem, and Britain is deluding itself, the Europeans will offer us an extension if there is a material change in the process of exiting. And Theresa May won't do that. We read in the Times this morning that this ludicrous fancy about the Vienna Convention and pulling out of treaties and Article 62 and basically made-up nonsense has been spouted as a way to try and solve this backstop problem. The backstop actually was asked for by the British government, not the Irish government. The British government promised no hard border. The idea that we're trapped by the backstop, well, actually, the Brexiteers are trapped by their own fantasies and delusions. And the problem is deeper than the general election, though, because we have a situation where the government has exactly one policy, and the House of Commons has twice, by massive votes, said it doesn't support that policy, and yet the government hasn't fallen. This is actually, in the old English constitutional tradition, the collapse of Cromwell's Parliament. It's the collapse of the 1640 settlement. The UK is going to have to find a way to become a constitutional country, and I don't think anyone has quite realised the implications of that. That conversation is going to be very difficult for the UK to have, and I don't see it surviving having that conversation. I think Scotland certainly, and maybe other parts will be gone by then.
Yeah, Alan, another complication, of course, as we talked about earlier, there are European elections coming up. What happens if the United Kingdom is still a member of the EU during those elections?
Gordon's right in the sense that it's most likely that the UK would have to fight those elections as it currently stands, and that's something that both major parties are really keen to avoid, because on the one hand you've got a unalloyed sort of Remain party potentially forming on one wing, and on the other you have the return, most likely, of Nigel Farage in one form or another for the Conservative Party, and that would split the Conservative Party in two if that were to happen. And when it comes to these votes in Parliament next week, do you want to have one final roll of the dice for my deal, Mrs May will ask, and the idea that these Conservative MPs will be faced with a resurgent party of Nigel Farage will sort of be one of Theresa May's sort of ace cards, if you like. These Conservative MPs were frit in 2014, 13, when Nigel Farage came onto the scene, and they'd be really wary of Nigel Farage and a resurgent sort of Brexit party being a feature of British politics.
And by the way, Nigel Farage gave a speech near Washington a couple of weeks ago where he said, you know, he's prepared to fight again if there's another referendum, and he said this time no more Mr. Nice Guy, and you know, frankly, he wasn't very nice the first time round. So,
David, even if there is some kind of settlement, I mean, there's going to be a long period of uncertainty, isn't it? What will happen in Britain during that period?
You mean building up to?
Well, I mean, even if there's some kind of deal, there'd be a long time before there's a trade deal with the Europeans.
Right. Yes. That's right. You know, in some ways, we're only at the beginning rather than the end.
Yeah.
Even if this is finally achieved and an exit happens, then there are months and years of trade deals on a bilateral basis. Just taking America for one example, the US has published its mandate, but Britain has been too busy to say what it wants from a trade deal with the US. So even if Brexit happened at the end of March, I think you probably wouldn't see talks in earnest until September, and then there's many issues to thrash out on both sides. So it's incredibly complex. And remember, so far...
But it needn't be complex. It needn't be complex because as a country, we are aligned in law and in all practices, that we've got the same level playing field to start with. Whereas all the other countries, you know, whether it's Canada or the USA or anywhere else in the world, does not have the unique position we do in the UK, that we are completely aligned. So it should actually be, if you wanted a simple agreement, we could have carried on the day after on those same terms. Right. And the EU don't want to do that because, of course, if they give us that deal, everybody else will want the same deal.
Go ahead, Gordon, very quickly. I've got 30 seconds.
Trade deals need to be adjudicated. Trade deals need to be adjudicated. Who would adjudicate between the UK and Europe to make sure they had the same thing? The European Court of Justice, and we want to leave that. That's why that's a dud deal. We pulled out of that, not the Europeans.
All right, and Gordon, one other very quick question.
Where there's a will, we can all work together. Where there is that will, we can all work together. If we want to go forward, we should go forward as friends and trade. That's what it's about.
Gordon,
we need institutions. We need institutions, not will.
One quick question, Gordon. The vote in Scotland, the Brexit vote was overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. There was an independence referendum in Scotland that was voted down. Could Brexit trigger off another vote?
Yes, I think almost certainly it will. At the moment, the SNP has been reactive. These events have been driven by the collapse, basically, of the English Parliament at Westminster.
Right.
Certainly, we're waiting to see what Nicola Sturgeon will say about a second independence referendum, but certainly it will happen.
Okay, and we have to leave. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for watching.